but I know a little bit of electrical.
Yeah, that's my background.
Nice.
Yeah. Went to school of engineering. Yeah, I ended up in broadcast engineering, but I majored in electrical engineering.
Ah, double D. Cool.
Yeah.
What school again?
Went to school of engineering.
Okay. When Alan gets back, we'll go ahead and get started.
You get your go to the girl dorm or something like that.
This is the first time I've been back in like 15, 20 years. It's really dating myself. I graduated in '95 from MIT, and then went on to work. But really, since '96, I haven't been back. So when I landed here a couple of days ago, I actually walked across the bridge and went back over to campus. So it was nice. Yeah, lots of construction going on, lots of redevelopment going on.
Yeah, I actually spent the afternoon yesterday.
Did you see some colleagues there?
Yeah, I went over to the CS department, and then CSA, it's called, the status center, which is kind of a building, and then went over to the stuff and such. But that's terrific.
All right, here we go. Get that closer to you. So welcome everybody. Thanks a lot for coming this morning. This is, of course, Robot Reporters. Test 1, 2. You can hear me anyway. So this, what'd you say? Okay. So this, of course, is Robot Reporters. My name is Andrew Humphrey, founder of the Digital Journalism Task Force for NABJ, and welcome once again. This topic became of interest to me a few years ago when I first read some articles about some of Northwestern's research into avatars that actually were telling the news. And so from then on, of course, we live in the era of drones. Of course, most people are familiar with military drones, but also in the field of journalism, many people are wondering, well, can drones also be used, or how do we use drones also for, of course, non-military purposes, of at least news gathering? And some of you may be familiar with a recent case. What are the risks associated with that? What are some of the pitfalls? And so on. And one of the ones that was highlighted more recently was actually in Connecticut, where a photographer, reporter actually used a drone to survey. It was either an accident, it was a cordoned off police area because of either an accident, because of an incident that involved a crime. And the authorities did not happen to like that. And the reporter slash photographer was almost or was brought up on charges akin to either trespassing, interfering with an officer, or akin to almost obstruction of justice. So those were some of the recent highlights and how I got interested in and what inspired me to actually go ahead and form this workshop that we have here today. And the panel we have here, some of them I've known earlier than others, and some of them I've just met recently. I'll first give a brief introduction to each of them, and then they'll go through each of their presentations, and then we can go ahead and have a lively discussion. First up is Danny Ellis. Danny Ellis is the co-founder and CEO of SkySpecs, LLC. He was born and raised in Kalamazoo, Michigan. He's also a fellow University of Michigan graduate, earning his BSc, Bachelor of Science in Engineering, and his MSc, his Master's in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Michigan. As I mentioned before, co-founded SkySpecs, LLC, and is very familiar with drones and unmanned vehicle systems and vehicles, and everything that entails, all that entails, especially when it comes to aerial vehicles, what it means regarding the FAA. And I'm sure he'll be able to politely brag about some of his recent accomplishments and his vast knowledge of the FAA and some of the work that he's doing currently with approval from the FAA, and what it may mean for you if you happen to be in the position or know people in the position of purchasing drones for yourself and trying to adapt them to either regulations that exist now or paying attention closely to what regulations may exist in the future. Larry Birnbaum is a co-founder and chief scientific advisor for Narrative Science. He is also the co-director of the Intelligent Information Laboratory at Northwestern. Washington, D.C. native. He earned his BS and PhD in computer science from Yale University. And he is an expert in synthetic documents or computer software that can actually write news stories. In addition, avatars and possibly robots one day that can eventually start telling the news. And oh, by the way, if you ever want, as you have your phones out, again, they're on silent, but if you want to tweet, the Twitter ID for SkySpecs and for Danny Ellis is at SkySpecs LLC. That's SkySpecs LLC. Medill School is the Twitter handle for Larry Birnbaum. And last but not least is Gino Vicci, who's a reporter and fill-in anchor right now for WNEM-TV in the Flint-Saginaw market in Michigan, earning his BS in communications, concentrating on journalism from Rochester College, also a graduate of Northwestern University with his master's in journalism. And he's had experience with working at Narrative Science, a company that specializes in computer software that can actually write news stories. And he's going to talk about today. So he's intimately familiar with the practical aspects of what we're talking about here today. And if you'd like to use his Twitter handle or follow him, it's Gino Vicci, G as in Greg, or Gino, INOVICCI. So without further ado, we're going to start with Danny Ellis. Yeah, naturally, when your workshop's on technology, it's technology.
No problem. Okay, you want to restart the computer? Okay, we're going to have to restart the computer, so it shouldn't take more than a couple of minutes. You know what? The setting's intimate enough. If you don't mind, we can go around the room and introduce ourselves to each other so we get to know one another a little bit better. Also, it's good for the presenters to know who the audience is. So, Rashonda, would you mind?
Good morning, my name is Rashonda Hall. I work with Business Wire in Chicago, and I oversee our media relations team that works with reporters and media in their story and scattering process.
Sir?
Bob Johnson, I work in Saginaw, opposite of Gino. I work in print and online, so at the Saginaw News and MLive Media Group.
Excellent. Do you have a Twitter handle?
Yeah, it's Bob Johnson, the #1 then word. So
Excellent.
Bob Johnson, one word.
Rashonda, do you have a Twitter handle?
Yes, it's at Rashonda Hall.
Excellent.
I'm Darlene Seals. My background's engineering, broadcast engineering. I run a company called Program Video, programvideo.com is our website. And you're here all about the robots.
Excellent.
I'm Alan Seals, Darlene's husband. I'm a meteorologist, chief meteorologist in Mobile, Alabama. Just interested to hear what's going on. I do have one question, hopefully someone can answer. My station, like many stations, is looking for captioning software, voice recognition that works without saying period, comma, colon.
Everyone, please continue while I go get a tech, and I'll be right back.
I'm Richard Wagoner. I'm the metro editor at the Seattle Times. We'd love to get a drone. I understand it's against the water plan.
Hi, Monique Johnson, freelance reporter
here. I'm a writer and a producer, most recently in Philadelphia at WCAU, and I'm really interested in this technology and what it can learn to be useful.
You seen the first year yet?
We're almost ready to do this. Yeah, oh, there it is.
Also, the hashtag for the seminar is NABJ Robots.
It's in preliminary, so we'll probably throw the presentation. Yeah. That'll work. All right, cool. Well, thanks for having me. As Andrew mentioned, my company is SkySpecs. We're based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And a little bit of background, he already mentioned my education from the University of Michigan, but I also wanted to mention kind of what got me here and how I met Andrew. In 2009, I founded the Michigan Autonomous Aerial Vehicles team. It was a student competition team at the University of Michigan because we wanted to build flying robots. And that was actually the first flight demonstration we gave Andrew at the university, and what led us to found SkySpecs to commercialize the technology we had been developing. So my team, we're all roboticists. We are engineers of a variety of disciplines, and not journalists by any means. And then recently, our team was recognized, and I was recognized in the 2014 Detroit Cranes 20 in their 20s award. And so that's actually gotten our name out there from coast to coast from this point. So we've been getting a lot of good recognition recently. So as I said, or as Andrew mentioned, I'm here to talk about drones, particularly their application in journalism. Just so you can kind of see, this is our very first prototype 2 years ago. And then our more recent flight prototype here. I don't have a picture of the newest one, which is actually back to painted white, and it looks pretty. It's got kind of all enclosed and ready to be deployed. Now, just so you guys understand where we came from, we have targeted a wide variety of markets, not just journalism. Actually, our very first market was inspection of large structures. And so this wind turbine is actually a picture I took from the ground at a wind farm in Michigan. And this is actually our very first customer. We don't have any paying customers in journalism. I'll get to the reason in that in a minute here with the regulatory environment. But this is the first legal application that we're going to be able to use our technology and prove that it works. And so we're going to be doing blade inspections of this wind turbine to try to replace what that guy's doing right now. So as you can see, he's climbing up and down the blade. And this goes for any large structure, whether it's bridges, buildings, cell towers, radio transmission towers, anything like that. And so we are proving our technology in this field before it's legalized in the greater U.S. airspace. But an overview of the field of drones. Ours is at the top there. And some of these you may recognize. In the top left is the DJI Phantom. The top right is 3D Robotics. They're a US-based company. The bottom one from left to right is an Ariane Scout, an AI Botics in the middle, and a micro drones on the right. These are not at all to scale. And these are 6 of probably hundreds of different companies out there that are developing these days. And to kind of get an idea, this is the price range on all of these. Some of them are, the price of a house. Some of them are, relatively inexpensive and easy to get your hands on today. They also can carry a wide variety of cameras and other sensors. The one on the bottom left actually is a thermal camera, which is great for search and rescue applications and, where you're trying to look for a heat differential. So a lot of you guys are familiar with the other the cameras on the screen here. And the point of the talk I want to give today is not how the technology is working, because you can go online and Google drones or UAVs and find them all over the place, but how it's actually going to pertain to your work tomorrow, next year, 5 years from now. Have any of you currently used a drone? Don't worry, I'm not going to report anybody to the FAA, but use a drone for a journalism piece? So, some of them that I pulled up real quick. This is actually in El Salvador, so not the U.S., and just to monitor a traffic jam. Instead of getting a news helicopter up, which is going to be tens of thousands of dollars, just taking this, a couple thousand feet in the air to monitor this from the sky. This one was actually in Arkansas, and this one has been scrutinized by the FAA. This was the tornado damage in Arkansas recently, and the operator of this was a hobbyist who just owned his own drone and wanted to help out, and actually in this particular case was getting in the way of a medical helicopter that was on approach. And so he, not only was he operating in illegal airspace, but he actually was potentially harming other people, even though he was trying to help out. And then, here, this is just someone also down here in La Prensa Grafica that is just monitoring the beach. It's not, this isn't any sort of emergency situation. He's not harming anybody. But if this was done in the United States, this would also be illegal in the journalism world. So, the FAA, that's what all of us, everybody in our world is concerned with at the moment. And if you guys do want to talk afterward or another point in this panel about the actual technology, I'd be happy to discuss the technology. But the key things here that I want to talk about are the regulations. Because this confuses everybody, and I am not pitching any actual legal advice. I am not a lawyer. But we do have a lot of knowledge of this world and have been working in it for over 5 years. So today, as the rules are stated, if you're a hobbyist, you can fly up to 400 feet, further than 5 miles from an airport, with a vehicle that weighs less than 55 pounds, maintain continuous visual line of sight. If you ever lose sight of it, whether it goes behind a building or past a tree, that is breaking the law. And there must always be a pilot in command. So what this means is you can't set the controls down, tell it to go on its flight path and go grab a sandwich on the side. You have to have your hands on the controls at all times. Now it is allowed to follow waypoints, but you must be in command throughout that flight. Now for the commercial side, you are not allowed to use a drone for compensation or hire or to further a business. So a very good example of this is the real estate market. Realtors all over the country have been using these to get unique shots of their properties and then sell their properties. Now they're arguing that they're a hobbyist, it's their own personal device that they bought, the realty company did not buy, and they're just taking these shots and putting them online. But because of the phrase to further their business, they're selling the house they took pictures of, therefore it is a commercial application, and as of today it is illegal in the entire United States. Now, you can get a certificate of authorization or an experimental certificate to use these for commercial purposes. But to date, only one has been granted. It was in northern Alaska in the Arctic Circle to BP to monitor their oil pipelines. And that was relatively recently, about maybe 2 months ago now. And so, what most people don't realize is even if they're just out having fun, you can go have fun. You can take pictures of a riot or of the traffic jam or that type of stuff, as long as you've obeyed the other rules. But as soon as you publish it, as soon as you make any sort of money on it, you have now violated the law. And that confuses a lot of people, and it's really the FAA trying to take their time to figure out what the rules should be. And so that is what takes me to this next part, is back in 2012, the FAA Modernization and Reform Act was passed. And that mandated that the FAA kind of get their act together by 2015 and figure out how are they going to allow these to be legal, because now that they are cheaper than ever before, that almost anybody can get their hands on them and use them, how is we going to make this legal? So there is a notice of proposed rulemaking that, from everything I've heard out of Washington, is supposed to be out in November. And what that will do is basically give a set of rules that we will all be able to follow sometime in the next 18 months after that. They haven't set a date as to when these rules are going to be put in place, but it will likely require everyone who's operating it to actually train as a pilot. Now today that is undefined, but there will be some sort of training, likely about a 2-week training course. It will require certification and a background check. It will also require that the craft you're operating has an airworthiness certificate, which actually is going to be quite challenging to get initially, but as this goes on further, there'll be ways to get everything certified. And then the FAA is also going to require that all safety data is reported back to them. So every single crash that happens is reported so they can build up a database and help to change the regulations as the years go on to make it as safe as possible. And like I said, likely by 2016, but we've learned working in this world that never rely on a date that they give you. Probably going to be by 2017, 2018, so it's still quite a ways away. Right now, there are 6 test sites around the country that are starting these commercial operations. So like I said, we do have legal clearance on wind farms, particularly on one site in North Dakota and one site in Texas. And they are very controlled sites. That's where our company is working with the FAA to fly around the wind farm, show that we can operate our technology safely. Once we can prove that, then we can start applying for these other certifications, and as the laws open up, get them into the hands of everybody else in the world that wants to use them. The core technology SkySpecs is working on is what we're calling our air bumper. It's obstacle avoidance. And if you've ever piloted one of these, you realize that they're actually incredibly easy to crash. And so what we're developing is a piece that will go on our drone, and will go on any of our competitors' drones, that will prevent you from running into trees, buildings, people, you name it. It will detect its environment and avoid that collision. And that is the core technology that we are trying to deliver. So anybody out there that's never flown one of these before, journalists, inspectors, search and rescue, they can pick one up out of the box, fly it around, and know they're not going to hit whatever is around them. It'll simultaneously also communicate to the other manned and unmanned aircraft in the airspace. So in that situation when the medical helicopter's coming in, it'll actually have a constant communication to it so that they can avoid each other when the medical helicopter is landing. So do you want to take questions now or after all the presentations? Okay, so so anyway, if you want to hear more about drones or know more specifically about the regulations, I'd be happy to discuss that later. So thank you very much.
Dr. Birnbaum?
Thank you.
Your cursor's over on the screen. Are we still moving?
There it is.
It's about getting to your file, the file window.
We're good. I think we're good here. Well, first of all, Andrew, thank you very much for having me here today. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to be here. My name is Larry Birnbaum. As Andrew said, I'm professor of computer science and journalism at Northwestern, and also co-founder and chief scientific advisor of the company Panelists Science, which is based in Chicago, actually. So I'm going to start off by just showing some examples of the kind of things we're doing. Can you hear me okay? Okay. All right. Just to show some examples of the things we're doing. These are the data from a hockey game from the Rio Grande Valley Killer Bees. So it's a hot place to play hockey. And these are the data we get in, and this is the story that our software will write based on these data. The Rio Grande Valley Killer Bees were firing on all cylinders against the Laredo Bucks, and when the final buzzer sounded, Killer Bees emerged with a 6-3 win. Zach Pearson was over the ice for Rio Grande Valley as he tallied 2 goals and 1 assist in the win. Pearson scored the first of his 2 goals at 5:23 in the first period to make the score 1-0 Rio Grande Valley, and so on. It's really not a bad story at all, and it's written automatically by computer. Of course, we do many more things than sports stories. We do business stories. So, for example, these are the data around quarterly earnings. And this is the story that our system writes based on these data. And we do actually quarterly earnings previews for Forbes.com regularly and have done for several years now, which report on these data, including analyst expectations and so on. And of course, the financial sector is a fantastic place in general, and even really numerically, the is a fantastic place in general to think about this. So, taking financial data and writing and doing sector reports, for example. The healthcare sector underperformed the market in early trading on Thursday. Healthcare stocks trailed the market by 0.4%. And then the particular one, Merck erased early losses and rose 0.6% to 31.26. The company recently announced its chairman is stepping down, and so on. Again, these stories have all been written automatically by computer. This is an interesting case. These are the data from a fast food franchise operation, which gathers tremendous amounts of very detailed point-of-sale data every single day, which are difficult to interpret, especially for a busy small business owner. This is the story that our system writes for these data. You know, what I like to say about this story is that this is a really boring story, unless this is your restaurant, in which case it's a really interesting story. Okay? And actually, the punchline of the story is what, you know, one of the things we think about when we think about how to craft these narratives in a meta sense is what is the takeaway. I mean, we try to think about this actually, I think, the way writers think generally. What's the takeaway from this meta narrative that the store owner ought to have? And in this case, it's what's one thing I can do this week to make more money. And so we call this the low-hanging fruit angle. And it tries to find, what it does is it tries to find the most underperforming product that you're selling this week that has the highest margin, and it brings that to your attention and says, hey, here's how much more money you make if you just sold a few of these a week. The store that these are based on doesn't actually sell Reuben sandwiches, by the way, but we have a spin whitewash a little bit. Why stories? I mean, I feel embarrassed to actually have this slide here for you folks because it's so obvious, but these are some data that if you actually were a financial analyst would probably make complete sense to you. And here's a chart that a visualization software might generate for you. And again, if you're financially savvy, you might actually be able to read this and get the right takeaway. But here's the story. While sales have increased, there has been a steady decrease in margins, which should be cause for concern. So in other words, the great thing about narratives is that they draw your attention to the critical aspects of the data. They don't just sort of jump it out there and say, hey, here's the data, find something. It really kind of pulls it out and makes the really critical stuff relevant. So maybe this is the way to summarize that is stories pick out, connect, and summarize the critical aspects of a situation, and they explain, they convey trends and causes. This is something. The third part is something I think is really very critical to our software is that people have these high-level themes or patterns of data that they understand and respond to and think about when they think about data. And we often have words for these things, and those words are just incredibly powerful because they convey so quickly so much information. So in a sporting event, for example, that there's a comeback, or in a career for that matter, or a fade, or the idea of low-hanging fruit. So these are themes that really describe so much data in one word. And so if you can find that right word, if you can find that pattern and apply it directly to the data, then you can actually convey very quickly to somebody a tremendous amount about that. So in other words, stories make data meaningful in context. So the first prototype that we did was actually done at Northwestern. It was a class prototype that we did. We have every year we teach a joint projects class in computer science and journalism at Northwestern, where we take computer science students and journalism students in the same course, and we put them on teams together, cross-functional teams, and make them work together to build something. And actually, I first met Gino when he took this class. I was the computer science instructor, and we always have a professor from computer science and from the middle school of journalism co-teaching this class. And actually, the very first prototype for this actually came out of that class, but I'll show you this is not that prototype. This is a more, these are the line score, the box score, the play-by-play data from a game actually almost 5 years ago now. The Chicago White Sox playing in Seattle, but the prototype probably wasn't done at the time that these data were generated. But anyway, this is not cached, so it's actually doing something. And here's what it did. Down to their last out, Griffey saves Mariners. Seattle. The Seattle Mariners were down to their final out when Ken Griffey came to play against Tony Pino on Wednesday, but he delivered a single to carry the Mariners to a 1-0 win over the Chicago White Sox in a 14-inning marathon at Safeco Field. After Adrian Beltre singled and Jackie Inner walked, the game was tied. Tied's an interesting word because it was 0-0, and I'm not sure if a human being would have said tied. But when Griffey came to play against Pena with two outs and runners on first and second, he singled scoring Beltre from second, which gave the Mariners a lead for good. And because it knows that Ken Griffey was the most important player, it actually scours the net and finds a photo of him and puts it up there for you. This is not a bad story. And actually, it's pretty, it's pretty comparable to the AP short game recap. We actually had a sports reporter at the Toronto Star dissect the story. He wrote about a Major League ball game and a story that our system wrote, and kind of put them together. And he was pretty happy. He said this is actually a pretty good story. Now the thing is that nobody really needs a machine to write. I apologize. Nobody needs a machine to write stories about Major League Baseball. And I'm just going to maybe I'll show you a little bit about this. Because there's a lot of money in Major League Baseball, but we're going to get to really what is the point of this in a second from the point of view, I think, of journalism. Obviously, I think the point of business is clear. There are all these data that are being generated all over the place in everything, in every field now. And actually, we should talk about meteorology probably, given that the meteorologists in the room at some point. In fact, the very earliest efforts, by the way, in auto-generated stories were done by meteorologists, and more than 25 years ago, and they weren't bad, by the way. Just to say a little bit about how the system works, it starts with the raw data, it derives some statistics and other kinds of derived data, using sometimes some of the well-known sports metrics, things like game score and things like that will actually be computed. It builds an outline of the story that includes those kinds of angles that we talk about, those patterns or themes. For example, this was a blowout victory, or this was in this case, I think this was a defensive struggle with a late win. Those themes are actually, we call them angles in the system, in sort of in homage to the reporter's notion of an angle, and then the story, which I already showed you. So we were pretty excited about this technology, which was co-invented by me, my research partner Chris Hammond, and two Medill School of Journalism students, Nick Allen and John Templon. And so we launched a company, Narrative Science, in 2010. A little bit about how it works. I guess I sort of said this to you already, that we start with the raw data. We do some analytics on those data to derive things like, I mean, there are kinds of things that happen that are important. Like for example, the company was unprofitable last quarter, and it's profitable this quarter, so it crossed zero. That's actually always an important threshold, So crossing thresholds or various kinds of statistical analyses, a little more complicated and domain-specific analytics, for example, the sports analytics that we talk about. And then the angles, these large patterns, have tests associated with them that look at the status of the raw data and the status of the derived features, and sort of says, do I apply? And then finally, that is used to actually build the story structure, and eventually you end up building some natural language that actually sort of expresses that. The thing I want to say about this that's important is that the important thing about this technology isn't sort of how to generate the English. The important thing is not how to say it, but what to say. Because you have this wall of data coming in, and you can't, for example, you can't just take the play-by-play and repeat it. That's not a story about a baseball game. You actually have to do some work to sort of analyze and summarize and condense and pull out what's important. And that's really what those angles do, and that's really the critical part of the technology. We sometimes call this narrative analytics or story-based analytics, but the idea is that there's really some there are ways that people look at these things that are really important. And I think part of the kind of artificial intelligence that we do is really around, making these things sort of relevant to human thinking. I think that's especially important in this application, because in the end the stories are meant to be read by people, so they have to be able to convey what's important in human terms. We're pretty proud of this. We did a project with ProPublica. They got data from the education department. And here Scott Klein wrote a story about how to edit 52,000 stories at once, but they gave us access to these educational data from the government, and we wrote stories about 52,000 schools in the United States. And here's an example. This is actually a story about my local high school, Evanston Township High School, which is a terrific high school. But what it does, it gives you the sort of basic stuff out of the database, but then it actually tells you how did this high school do compared to its peers on a bunch of known standardized tests, for example, how many kids are taking AP classes, or how many kids are actually, at reading level, for example. And what it does that's really interesting, and this is what made these stories interesting, is it compares it to other schools in the area with similar and with different socioeconomic and demographic factors, because that's part of one of the critical things when you look at a school is, who are they trying to educate, and how can they, are they succeeding? If you go one school district north from this school, you're in, probably the richest high school district in the United States, New Trier Township, which is not a very demographically balanced district at all. And so, you have a completely different story there. And we do social media data as well. So this is actually an experiment we did during the Republican primaries a couple of years ago. So social media data, Twitter, for example, are unstructured. They're natural language, free text, for example. And our technology starts from structured data. So the first thing we have to do when we look at unstructured data is to structure it so that we can write a story about it. So here's the story. Newt Gingrich gains attention with hot-button topics, taxes, character issues. Newt Gingrich received the largest increase in tweets about him today. Twitter activity associated with the candidate has shot up since yesterday, with most users tweeting about taxes and character issues. So the first paragraph, I think, is sort of the bread and butter of what's going on in terms of up and down on Twitter. I like the second paragraph a lot. While the overall tone of the Gingrich tweets is positive, public opinion regarding the candidate and character issues is trending negatively. In particular, Mama Vicker says someone needs to put the blood-armed, suspicious character to a photo montage of Newt Gingrich, and then there's an interesting hashtag. And what it was doing here is it was saying, I want to find a, so it does a topical analysis, find a topic on which which has a different sentiment associated with it than most of the things around this candidate, and call that out because it's an interesting thing. So it doesn't. I want to make it clear that this thing does not understand what character issues are, and it doesn't understand even what positive and negative are, except it's got some little gizmos to actually help it do that. And once it makes that analysis, it can report on it. So I think it's pretty cool, actually. Here's the thing about sports. I mean, we do Big Ten, for the Big Ten Network, we do Big Ten football, baseball, basketball. Those are big business. We also do women's softball, actually, and I don't have a women's softball story here, but we write about every Big Ten women's softball game. The Daily Northwestern, I think, maybe writes about a fraction of the games that our women's softball team plays. Our software is now the nation's most prolific author of women's collegiate softball game stories. And the thing is that matters because it's a small audience, but it is an audience. It's the students on the team, it's their friends and family, it's alumna who used to be on the team. I mean, and it's a big world, and I'm sure there are people, even in Europe, who probably care about Big Ten women's collegiate softball. So, anyway. But this was a very exciting thing. There's a company called Game Changer, which has a smartphone scoring app so if a coach or a parent scores a Little League game, we get the data, and we write stories like this. Richmond Rampage escapes sudden impact behind Morris's 5 strikeouts, 6-0. A superb effort by Cat Morris lifted Richmond Rampage to a 6-0 win in 7 innings over the Blue Ridge sudden impact on Sunday at Garden Toe, Charlottesville, and so on. And again, this is a really cool story because it's a story about some kids, maybe 10 people, maybe one person would read this story. The first year that we did these, we did 350,000 Little League stories by machine. That was in 2011. Probably this past summer,
How many?
It was 350,000 Little League stories by machine, and we're probably
What season?
That was 2011.
Wow.
And I know that last year we did more than 3 million, and I'm sure we'll do more than that again this summer. So it's, and again, these are not read by very many people, but that's the point. I mean, and this is something for us to chew on when we get into the discussion, but these are not stories that would get written by any human being. Because
so, when you do these stories, are you giving them to, are you doing them for the local paper, or are you doing them for your
that's a great question. We give these back to Game Changer, and they have a business model where they have subscribers who actually use their software to do and we're mainly around the statistics and the keeping the statistics, but this is a value add for them in terms of their customers. But And we can talk about how do we actually get these things out there. Some of them are, like I said, the quarterly earnings previews are stuff published at Forbes.com. We do BigTenNetwork.com, sports stories. A lot of our stories are not published in a normal sense. They take proprietary data, we write a narrative, and we send it back to whoever gave us that data, and then they use it for their customers or for their internal purposes. This is something you can all try out. And if you do any website analytics, if you use Google Analytics, you can go to narrativescience.com and you can sign up for a free report developed by our system called Quill Engage, where if you give us your Google Analytics credentials, we'll take the data about your website and we'll write a weekly and a monthly report for you automatically that highlights the most critical things about that. Narrativescience.com. One word, yeah. And N-A-R, yeah. So I hope we've given you a little bit of thought about taste of sort of what the technology can do in terms of writing. So Andrew had asked me to talk a little bit, and he was fascinated by the use of text-to-speech and animated avatars to actually present what's actually been generated. And the technology I'm about to show you actually was primarily built by my colleague Chris Hammond and his student Nate Nichols. And it doesn't use the same technology we just talked about to generate. This is actually built by assembling pieces from around the internet. But I want to show it to you because it's an example of maybe what's coming. All right, I'm going to go back. Just a second. I'm going to dismiss this little. Give me one moment here. I'm going to give it a try. This was the punchline of the whole talk. Not real. Let's see if we can do this. Okay. Sorry. The Vodka script. I apologize. I really do. I'm going to get this right, so just give me 2 seconds. And I really don't know what this. Oh, you see this? That's the problem.
There we go.
Alrighty. So we're going to do this. We're going to do this one more time. Third time.
And while he's doing it, feel free to vine it if you like to, or take out your phone and Instagram video if you want to.
Welcome to Factory Studios. In today's news, Chris Brown issued the following statement Sunday, February 15th.
I thought Chris Brown was cool, but now I know better than that.
Words cannot begin to express how sorry and saddened I am over what transpired. I am seeking the counseling of my pastor, my mother, and other loved ones, and I am committed, with God's help, to emerging a better person.
That's messed up because I thought that Chris Brown was a good guy, very sweet, and Rihanna doesn't look like she poses any harm to him.
Following the controversy, a person with access to the Christopher Maurice Brown Facebook page changed their relationship status to single and then posted, "You'll begin to see her true colors." Believe it.
At first I thought that Chris Brown was just good for looks, but when I heard his album, I was totally shocked.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time, it's Silly and Zach at Zactivate Studios.
So it's not perfectly coherent, but it does, it's sort of the beginnings of a thing that can actually pull together a story and present it based, again, on existing content that's been repurposed from human-authored content from the internet, including stuff written by amateurs and just stuff posted by ordinary folks. And I'm going to... Oh, okay. So, I guess I should go to this slide.
The computers are taking over.
It is, I know. This is my thank you slide. My colleagues, students, funders, and of course Narrative Science for making it real. Thank you very much.
All right, Gino, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, no, my name is Gino Vicci. I'm a reporter and fill-in anchor anchor at TV5 in Flint and Saginaw, and watching this presentation, you kind of you're either thinking one of two things. You're either thinking, this is really cool. How do I become a part of it? Or, oh crap, we're going to lose more jobs. And one of the things when I first heard about narrative science at Northwestern, a gentleman named Dan Platt came in our classroom and said, hey, we're looking for some paid interns. And anytime you hear paid internship in journalism, you're like, what is it? What is it? There's internships that pay. So, and he gave us a presentation, and I just thought to myself, is this real? I mean, can a computer really write a story? And, I thought to myself, this could be a threat. This could definitely be a threat. But when I started working at narrative science, I realized it was anything but. I mean, it was a tool to help us journalists get something back that was taken away as a result of cuts in the newsroom. There's no secret, newsrooms are getting smaller. And this was one of those ways that we could get something back that was taken, through technology. So, like I said, I'll speak a little bit about my experience there. So, first of all, I had no experience in coding whatsoever before I worked at narrative science. I had every intention of pursuing television news. So when when they accepted me as an intern, I was very clear I don't have any computer programming experience, and they said that's fine. And so basically, my job was to teach the software how to say the same thing many different ways, and I would do that in computer terms. I'd be assigning, I would basically write sentences in the code instead of the code having a value of a number. It would have a value of a set of words or strings, right? So, my job had a lot to do with code, actually. So, basically, I witnessed that with a lot of human intervention, actually. It is a computer that writes stories, but with a lot of human intervention, it can write really good stories. Like sports stories and quarterly earnings stories. A sports writer might look at this and say, well, where does that leave me? If this computer can write a story about a box score, where does that leave me? I think it leaves you with more time to focus on the elements of the story that people care about also. Tell us about the weather. Tell us about how frustrated the pitcher was when back-to-back home runs were hit. So the emotion, you can focus on the emotion of the story, which is what a lot of people are interested in anyway. Have the computer automate the very time-consuming parts of writing a story. So basically, I asked myself, how is this going to relate? I kept looking at how this is going to relate to me working in television, and it does. It relates in many ways because, I think like, the old traditional news model is gone. People don't come to television, sit down, and wait for it. Television needs to come to them. I think TV stations are websites with television studios instead of television studios with websites. I think that we need to kind of change the dynamic of how we think about technology. It is part of what we do. We cannot move forward in print and television without really thinking about how these technologies are going to move us forward. I think this is really the key to surviving in the future. A lot of people have asked me, well, how do I fit in? How do I do this? The thing is, like, I don't think any television station or media company has exactly figured out how to monetize the web or any of this the way it has been monetized traditionally. So, and sometimes, speaking on the class I took with Larry, called Collaborative Innovation, where it was computer science majors who, essentially knew nothing about journalism, and journalism students who essentially knew nothing about computer science. And, that kind of collaboration was, it created some really good stuff, and which is, proof in my mind that you don't need to know much about this technology in order to make a difference, because sometimes fresh ideas without knowing the restrictions of how something can work, you can actually be a little more creative than someone who does know everything and all the capabilities of the limits to something. So and ever since I've been teaching myself code, I'm pretty good at Java now. I'm learning Python now, and how does it relate right now? Not much, but I'm sure that it will, one day soon. I'm sure it's going to make a huge difference to know. I look at computer coding like it's a language, and it's a language that we're all going to need to know how to communicate in one day. So.
All right, thank you very much, Gino. Please give a round of applause. Now's the time for question and answer, including from you guys in the audience. Now, start things off here. We'll start with Danny. For everyone who just entered, we have Danny Ellis of SkySpecs LLC. In the middle, we have Gino Vicci, a reporter and anchor at WNEM, also a former employee and intern at Narrative Science, talking about his practical experience you just heard, and Dr. Larry Birnbaum over at Northwestern University. Danny, the first picture you showed was, one of the first things you mentioned was you had the idea of using drones to survey wind turbines, and you showed a picture of a Cuban turbine inspector on basically a pulley system in a rig, inspecting one manually. And you said, well, how can we replace that guy? And as Gino mentioned, that sounds like a threat also to living, working journalists now. Can you elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, so we actually aren't replacing his role as an inspector. We're replacing his job of climbing. And actually speaking to those guys, it's the part of the job they hate the most. So for those guys, they are there to actually apply their engineering and technician skills to fix the structure, to inspect it, and have their expertise, which we are a long way off of a robot detecting a problem, a flaw in a structure, and categorizing it, especially on things where humans are using it for safety, such as a bridge. We're going to require human eyes on that for a very long time. But from the reporting standpoint, in the near term, in the next I'd say 5 to 8 years, drones will still require an operator to be hands-on. But beyond that, you will still need the reporter to be able to tell the vehicle where to go, tell it what type of data they want to collect, and how they're going to publicize that to the rest of the world, even if you're not the one piloting the helicopter to go up there. So in the future, it is going to be replacing certain aspects of jobs, potentially the $10,000 per hour helicopter pilot, but not the people that want the data to report on it. And it's actually providing that data to people much cheaper and easier than ever before. Like, you could be in a smaller city that can't afford a helicopter to go look at the traffic jam or anything like that. In the not so distant future, you will be able to afford the drone to go up and get that data and even be competitive with some of the bigger news stations that do have the money for a helicopter. I don't think the drones themselves are going to replace reporters or any of the film crews anytime soon. It's just a different tool for them to use to collect that data that they want from a different perspective than they do today.
But Gino and Larry, to make the analogy, Danny just said you're not really replacing the man inspecting the person inspecting the wind turbine, but you're replacing his climbing. The analogy to news is, well, you're not replacing the journalist, but you're replacing the journalist writing or story gathering, which is the essence of what a journalist does. Is that analogy fair, and what do you think about that?
I'll go first. Actually, one of the projects I worked on in Larry's class, the Collaborative Innovation class, I developed a tool with computer science majors to help investigative journalists. Investigative journalists they're already gone. Okay, so in my view, the technology allows us to get something back that we don't have anymore. So no, it's not. No one's losing a job because of the technology. We're able to replace functions in the newsroom that no longer exist. That's really the way I look at it.
I think that the stories that our technology is being used to generate would not be written by a human being. It would not be cost effective to ever have them written by a human being. And so, to the extent that I don't think they're actually they're not replacing any current writer. that having been said, I think all of us are, I think this is a bigger issue than, I know that you're journalists, and so your concern will be with your profession, but, there's a larger social or societal trend here around automation, which is something I think we're all going to have to think about, and it's a gigantic issue, and it's not something that technologists by themselves really know what to do about. I'll be perfectly honest here. It is something that I think we're going to have to address. We can go completely, to another thing and talk about driverless cars, because once there are driverless cars, there'll be driverless trucks, and there'll be and then there's a lot of people right now whose jobs are, in transportation, who help move around people and things that we need to make our society function. And so, and yet we can also see that eventually this technology will not only be cheaper, it'll be safer. That's the thing, it'll be safer than humans. So it'll be very difficult to say, no, we shouldn't do that. And I'm sorry to change the subject, but I hope that wasn't sort of blowing it up too much anyway.
No, that's fine, because I think it might transition into another thought. I'm sorry, from Seattle?
Oh, just a few things. It's my understanding that AP is using, I don't know, they're using your program or some other similar program to write earnings reports now.
That's correct,
so
yeah.
it seems to me they are replacing.
I can comment on that directly, because I work at AP and I work on that project.
Okay, all right, great. And the other thing is,
that's with our competitors.
Just out of curiosity, if you run that same data, like you wrote that story up there, if you run that again, is it the exact same story? Or does
it can be, or it can be different depending on whether you care. So the reality is that in general, what the story looks like depends on what the data are, and variations in the story really reflect natural variations in the world. Important variations. It is the case, obviously, that computers will do what they're going to do, and if you want it to look differently, you have to actually make it so that it will look differently, and we do things like that. In general, it doesn't matter, because, for example, if the Little League stories, if you read 10,000 of them, it might begin to sound